It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the world felt like it was wrapped in a soft blanket. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the countertops cluttered with remnants of breakfast. My husband had already left for his usual weekend run, his silhouette disappearing down the street with the same predictability as every other Sunday. I washed the dishes, the hum of the water masking the emptiness in the house. Our life was by all accounts perfect. We had the kind of marriage that looked beautiful from the outside. 2 steady incomes, a cozy home, and routines that kept the days in a gentle rhythm. But beneath the surface, there was a silence between us, not the comforting kind but a hollow echo of words unspoken and touches unfelt. It wasn't that he was unkind or inattentive, he was just absent even when he was home. His mind always seemed a few steps ahead, planning, calculating, lost in his own world. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel, my fingers brushing against the smooth cotton. It was one of those mundane moments when everything changes. A quick glance out the window and I saw him, the new neighbor. He stood in his driveway, wrestling with a stack of moving boxes, his expression a mix of determination and frustration. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about him, yet something about the way he moved caught my attention. Maybe it was the ease with which he smiled at the woman helping him, perhaps his sister, maybe a friend, or the way he wiped his brow, unbothered by the sweat beading on his forehead. I told myself it was just curiosity, nothing more. After all, it was natural to wonder about the people moving into the house next door. I stepped onto the porch, the coolness of the wood against my bare feet grounding me. "Need a hand?" The words were out before I had a chance to reconsider. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing against the sunlight. "That would be amazing, thank you." His voice was warm, carrying a hint of surprise as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone offer help. The next moments passed in a blur of cardboard, small talk, and laughter that came too easily. His name slipped into the conversation and I let it roll around in my mind, testing the way it sounded when I said it. There was a casual intimacy in the way we worked side by side, sharing the weight of each box, the brief touches as our hands brushed against the same surface. At some point he handed me a box lighter than it appeared. I stumbled slightly and his hand shot out, steadying me. His touch was brief but firm, his fingers wrapping around my wrist, a small gesture that lingered far longer than it should have. I pulled away gently, brushing off the moment with a quick laugh, but inside something had shifted. When the last box was in place, he offered me a bottle of water, his gratitude evident in the way he held my gaze. "I owe you one," he said, and there was a softness to his expression that made me look away. "It's nothing. Just being neighborly," I replied, but my voice sounded foreign to me, too light, too eager. As I walked back to my house, I felt the weight of his eyes on me. I didn't turn around. Instead, I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as if it could hold back the tide of emotions swelling inside. There was a heat in my cheeks, a quickening in my pulse that had nothing to do with the summer air. It was a moment, a spark, and yet it settled into my bones with a quiet certainty. When my husband returned, his shirt damp with sweat and his breath coming in controlled gasps, I greeted him with a smile. He kissed my cheek, his lips cool and indifferent, and I found myself comparing the warmth of his touch to the stranger's brief grasp. I pushed the thought away, burying it beneath the weight of laundry and grocery lists. But deep down I knew something had changed. The air felt charged, the quiet of our home now a reminder of all the things left unsaid. That night, as I lay next to my husband, the space between us felt like an ocean. His breathing was steady, rhythmic, a lullaby that once brought me comfort but now only underscored the silence. My thoughts drifted to the man next door, to the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled and the warmth of his voice. I felt a pull, gentle but insistent, a whisper that teased at the edges of my mind. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but the image of him lingered in the darkness. And in that stillness I knew this was not the end, only the beginning of something I could not yet name. Days slipped into one another, a blur of ordinary routines. I moved through life on autopilot, work, chores, dinners that filled the silence more than our words ever could. My husband remained a fixture in our home, his presence more like a piece of familiar furniture than a living, breathing partner. He was there but not really. His mind wandered even when his body sat across from me at the dinner table, his fingers scrolling endlessly through work emails or investment portfolios. And yet, beneath the layers of routine, a quiet storm was brewing. I found myself glancing out the window more often, my eyes drawn to the house next door. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him, my neighbor, watering his plants or tinkering with his car. Each accidental sighting felt like a secret, a small thrill I kept hidden beneath my practiced smile. It was during one of those aimless afternoons that I decided to take a walk. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain, but the fresh air felt like an escape. My feet led me to the small park a few blocks away, a secluded patch of green that rarely saw visitors during the weekday. I welcomed the solitude, the soft rustle of leaves, the way the wind played with the hem of my dress. I was lost in thought when I heard his voice. "Fancy meeting you here." I turned and there he was standing a few paces away. His hair was tousled by the wind, his jacket unzipped to reveal a simple white t-shirt beneath. He looked both casual and out of place, as if he had wandered into my world from a dream. "Do you come here often?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, stepping closer. "It's quiet. Good place to think." We fell into step together, our conversation flowing easily. He spoke of his work, his love for old movies, and the joy he found in fixing things with his hands. I shared stories of my own, small pieces of myself that felt safe to reveal. It was strange, how natural it felt, how my guard slipped away in his presence. When the first drops of rain began to fall, we didn't rush. Instead, we found refuge under the awning of a small, closed cafe. The rain came down harder, turning the world into a blur of gray. We stood close, the air between us charged, and I felt the weight of his gaze. "You're shivering," he said, his voice low. I hadn't noticed. A shiver did run through me, but it wasn't from the cold. His jacket slipped off his shoulders and around mine before I could protest. The warmth of the fabric, still carrying his scent, wrapped around me like a promise. "Thank you," I managed, my breath catching in my throat. The world outside seemed to fade away, the rain muffling everything except the soft thud of my heartbeat. His hand moved, a hesitant brush against my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin. It was such a small gesture, and yet it unraveled something deep within me. I closed my eyes, not out of fear but anticipation, the kind that made every nerve stand on edge. When his lips met mine, it was not sudden. It was slow, deliberate, a question as much as it was an answer. The world did not stop, the rain did not pause, but in that moment, it felt as if it might have. His lips were warm, his touch gentle, and I found myself leaning into it, letting the moment consume me. When we pulled apart, the air between us was thin, fragile. His expression mirrored my own, a mix of surprise and something deeper, something neither of us dared name. I wanted to speak, to fill the silence with words, but none came. Instead, we stood there, the rain a soft curtain between us and the rest of the world. Eventually, he stepped back, his jacket still draped around my shoulders. "We should get you home." I nodded, my voice lost somewhere between my lips and my heart. The walk back was a blur, my mind replaying the kiss over and over, each time more vivid than the last. I knew I should feel guilty, that this was a line crossed, a boundary shattered. But all I felt was warmth, a lingering heat where his lips had touched mine. When I slipped through the front door, the house was as I had left it. Quiet, predictable, a safe harbor. My husband's keys were on the table, his shoes neatly by the door. I slipped off the jacket, folding it carefully before hiding it in the back of my closet. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside me had only just begun. That night, as I lay beside my husband, his breathing a steady metronome, I felt the space between us like an unbridgeable chasm. His hand found mine under the covers, a habitual gesture of comfort, but his touch felt foreign. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of the kiss wash over me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to alive. The days following that kiss unraveled like a spool of thread, each moment pulling me further away from the tightly woven fabric of my life. I moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of habit, preparing breakfast, folding laundry, arranging flowers in the vase by the window, but my mind was elsewhere. It lingered in the space beneath that cafe awning, where the rain had turned the world into a private cocoon and his lips had awakened something I could no longer ignore. My husband remained blissfully unaware. His days were consumed by work, his conversations peppered with half-formed thoughts about meetings and project deadlines. He floated on the surface of our life, never noticing the undercurrent that threatened to pull me under. I wondered, not for the first time, if he truly saw me at all. One evening as I set the table for dinner, he announced a surprise. I was thinking we could go away this weekend. Just the two of us. I paused, the silverware in my hand catching the light. Away. Where? He shrugged, his eyes still on his phone. I don't know. Maybe the coast? It's been a while since we've done something together. There it was, the gesture I had been waiting for, the sign that he still cared, still wanted me. And yet, instead of the warmth I expected, I felt only the chill of hesitation. The thought of leaving felt like closing a door, locking away the possibility of another moment with him. The neighbor, the man who had slipped under my skin with a single touch. I forced a smile, nodding. That sounds nice. But life has a way of unraveling plans before they are even set. The next morning, as the suitcases lay open on the bed, half-packed with sweaters and worn paperbacks, his phone rang. I knew that ring, the insistent trill of urgency that had stolen so many moments from us. He answered with a frown, his voice dropping into that clipped, businesslike tone. I didn't need to hear the words to know. The weekend was over before it had begun. I'm sorry, he said, his fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose. They need me. There's an issue with the project and I'm the only one who can fix it. His apology hung in the air, weightless and empty. I wanted to be understanding, to say all the right things, but my patience had worn thin. It was not the first time and it would not be the last. His work was a living, breathing entity in our home, an uninvited guest that always took precedence. It's fine, I said, my voice too even, too calm. Go do what you need to do. He left with a kiss to my forehead, a brotherly gesture that stung more than he realized. The door closed and I stood in the silence, surrounded by the remnants of a weekend that would never happen. The half-packed bags, the soft sweater I had chosen because he once said he liked the way it felt beneath his hand, all of it a reminder of how easily our plans unraveled. I moved through the motions of unpacking, each item finding its way back to its place. The sweater, the books, the toiletries, all restored to their rightful order as if nothing had ever been disturbed. But inside, nothing was where it should be. My thoughts tangled, knotted around the memory of the kiss, the unspoken promise in his eyes. Without a clear decision, I found myself outside, the cool air biting against my skin. My feet led me one step after another until I stood before his house. I hesitated, my breath a thin cloud in the afternoon light. What was I doing? What did I expect? The door opened before I could knock. He stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, a question in his eyes. Are you okay? I nodded, the lie pressing against my lips. I just needed to get out of the house. He stepped aside, an invitation unspoken. I moved past him into the warmth of his home, where the air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. It felt different from my own home. Lived in, imperfect, a space that held more than just things but moments, feelings. We sat on the worn couch, a cushion between us like a fragile boundary. He didn't press me, didn't ask for more than I could give. Instead, he turned on a movie, the kind with old cars and sharp dialogue, and for a while we sat in comfortable silence. The movie was only a backdrop, a way to fill the space between us with something other than unspoken words. At some point, I felt his hand near mine, not touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. My own hand moved, a slow, deliberate shift until our fingers brushed. It was such a small thing, but it sent a shiver through me, a reminder of how starved I was for connection. When I finally left, the sky had darkened, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. He stood in the doorway watching me go, and I felt his gaze long after I turned the corner. I walked home slowly, each step a reminder that I was walking back into the life I had built, the life that now felt too tight, too constricting. The house was dark when I returned. I moved through the rooms, touching objects as if they could anchor me, remind me of who I was supposed to be. My phone vibrated, a message from my husband. I'll be late. Don't wait up. I set the phone down, the words a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. He was always late, always somewhere else, while I stood in the doorway of my own life, wondering when it had become so empty. And there, in the quiet of that empty house, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Each step I took seemed to echo, a reminder that no matter where I went, I was moving further away from the woman I had once been, and closer to the edge of something I could not yet see. The following days wrapped themselves around me like a blanket woven with expectation and uncertainty. My husband's absence extended from his physical self to his presence in my thoughts. He moved like a shadow through our home, his schedule a tightly wound coil of meetings and obligations. His apologies came in soft murmurs and fleeting touches, but they never landed. His world spun on its own axis and I remained on the periphery, a satellite in his orbit. I began to notice the small things. The way the house seemed to echo in his absence. The cold stretch of bed sheets where his warmth should have been. I moved through my days with a sense of detachment, a hollow echo where my life used to resonate. It was in these empty moments that my mind wandered next door, to the warmth of his voice, the subtle strength of his hands, and the unspoken connection that hummed between us. It wasn't long before I found myself at his door again. This time there was no pretense, no thin veil of an excuse. I stood on his porch, my knuckles brushing the wood of the door as if testing its solidity. The door opened before I knocked, as if he had been waiting, as if he had known. "You keep finding your way back here," he said, a soft smile touching his lips. "I needed some air," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. He stepped aside, allowing me into the cocoon of his home. The space felt lived in, a stark contrast to my own home where everything sat in perfect, unyielding order. His books were stacked in uneven piles, the blanket on the couch was rumpled, and the faint smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. It was a home that felt like a heartbeat, imperfect, alive. He moved to the kitchen, pouring me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one. It was a small gesture, the kind that came from knowing someone, from anticipating their needs. I watched him move, the casual grace in his steps, the way his fingers curled around the handle of the cup. There was an ease to him that I envied, a quiet confidence that made the air around him feel different, softer, more forgiving. He handed me the cup and our fingers brushed. A small spark, a reminder of the line we had already crossed, and the uncharted territory that lay ahead. I wrapped my hands around the cup, drawing warmth from it, anchoring myself to the moment. We sat on the couch, the same space where we had shared quiet moments before. The silence between us was comfortable, a shared understanding that words were not always necessary. He leaned back, his arm draped over the back of the couch, his body angled toward me. It was a casual posture, but every line of his body spoke of readiness, of waiting. "I was going through some old things," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Found something I thought you might like." He reached to the side table, his fingers brushing against a small leather-bound book. He held it out to me, his expression a mix of hope and hesitation. I took it, the leather soft and worn, the pages etched in gold leaf that had long since faded. The title was embossed in delicate script, a classic novel whose story I had loved in my youth. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She used to read it to me when I was a kid. I thought you might enjoy it." I traced the cover with my fingers, a lump forming in my throat. It was not just a gift. It was a piece of him, a fragment of his past offered freely. I swallowed hard, emotions thick in my chest. No one had given me something so thoughtful in a long time. My husband bought gifts out of duty. Flowers on anniversaries, jewelry on birthdays, but they felt like items checked off a list, not tokens of understanding. "Thank you," I managed, my voice rough. "This means a lot." He shrugged, a small movement that belied the significance of the gesture. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to have it." We sat like that for a while, the book heavy in my lap, his presence a comforting weight beside me. I found myself leaning into the moment, letting my guard slip. His hand moved to mine, a slow, deliberate motion. His fingers laced with mine, warm and solid, grounding me. I didn't pull away. Instead, I turned my hand, our palms meeting, a quiet affirmation. His thumb moved in slow circles against my skin, a rhythm that matched the steady thud of my heart. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth seep into me, filling the spaces that had long been empty. When I finally looked up, his face was closer, his expression open and unguarded. I could see the small flecks of green in his eyes, the fine lines at the corners that deepened when he smiled. His other hand moved, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch light but deliberate. Time seemed to stretch, the world outside fading into a muted backdrop. His lips hovered just a breath away, a question waiting to be answered. I felt the pull, the quiet, insistent force that drew me toward him. My breath caught, my body a live wire, every nerve attuned to the space between us. And then without a word I closed the distance. His lips met mine, soft and warm, a whisper against the cool air. It was not a kiss of urgency or need, but of understanding, a quiet promise, a shared secret. I let myself sink into it, let the moment wrap around me like a shroud, hiding me from everything else. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath mingling with mine. "You should go," he said, his voice a mix of regret and hope. "Before it's too hard to say no." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I rose, my legs unsteady, the weight of the book still in my hands. He walked me to the door, his presence a steadying force. As I stepped into the cool air, I felt the loss of him like a physical ache. The world outside seemed sharper, colder, the edges of reality cutting into the softness of the moment we had shared. I walked home slowly, my feet moving on autopilot. The book felt heavy, its weight a reminder of the lines I had crossed and the ones that still lay ahead. The house greeted me with its familiar silence, the walls echoing with the emptiness I had grown used to. That night as I lay in bed, my husband's form a shadow beside me, I opened the book. The pages whispered under my fingers, the words a bridge between two worlds, the one I lived in and the one I found myself drawn to. And as I read, I felt the pull of the story, the promise of escape and the quiet, insistent call of a life I had not yet dared to imagine. The days melted into one another, each filled with the quiet rhythm of my life. I continued to play the role of the dutiful wife, my actions practiced and deliberate. I prepared meals, folded laundry, and greeted my husband with a smile that barely reached my eyes. He moved through our home like a ghost, his presence more of a shadow than a partner. His work remained the third presence in our marriage, filling the spaces between us with phone calls, emails, and the ever-present hum of his laptop. But beneath the surface, a different story unfolded. I found myself drawn to the book he had given me, its worn pages a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. I read it in quiet moments, letting the words wash over me, transporting me to a world where passion and connection were not just possibilities but certainties. Each chapter felt like a secret, a thread binding me to him. My neighbor, the man who had become more than just a distraction. Our paths continued to cross, each encounter a careful dance around the truth neither of us dared to name. He would find reasons to be outside when I walked to my car, his casual greetings laced with a familiarity that sent warmth blooming beneath my skin. I would linger on the porch, pretending to adjust the flowers or retrieve the mail, my eyes drawn to his movements, the quiet grace of his presence. It was on a cool afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds, that our paths converged in a way that felt both accidental and inevitable. I had finished my errands earlier than expected, the day still stretched out before me. I drove through the neighborhood, the hum of the car a white noise that allowed my thoughts to wander. Without intention, I found myself turning onto his street, my car slowing as I neared his house. He stood by his driveway, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, his posture relaxed. When he saw my car, a smile touched his lips, soft and genuine. I hesitated, my hands gripping the steering wheel, but he raised a hand in greeting, a small gesture that felt like an invitation. Before I could think better of it, I pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. "Hey," he said as I rolled down the window. His voice was a familiar melody, a note of comfort amidst the chaos of my thoughts. "Hi." My own voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He leaned against the car, his presence a quiet weight. "You look like you could use some company." I opened the door, the motion more instinct than choice. He slid into the passenger seat, the space between us suddenly too small, too charged. The car became its own world, a bubble where the outside ceased to exist. I felt the pull of him, a gravity I could not resist, and I wondered if he felt it too. We sat in the stillness, the soft hum of the engine a backdrop to the silence. His hand rested on the console between us, his fingers tracing idle patterns against the leather. I found myself mirroring the motion, my own hand moving until our fingertips brushed. The contact was brief but electric, a spark that ignited the air around us. He turned to me, his expression open, vulnerable. "I've been thinking about you," he said, the words a confession. His voice held no expectation, only truth, and it slipped into the space between us, settling into my skin. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached out, my hand finding his. His fingers tightened around mine, a subtle reassurance. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt a shiver run through me, an echo of the first time he had steadied me, the first moment our worlds had collided. His face was close, the air between us thin and trembling. I leaned forward, the movement slow, deliberate. Our lips met, a soft press, a question answered without words. His kiss was not a rush but a pull, a gentle draw that left me breathless. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin, a small motion that sent warmth spiraling through me. The world outside blurred, the glass fogging with our breath. I lost myself in the rhythm of him, the way his lips moved against mine, the quiet strength in his touch. It was a kiss that spoke of possibilities, of the spaces between us and the bridges we had yet to cross. When we pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the tight space of the car. His hand remained on my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, a tether that held me to the moment. I closed my eyes, savoring the quiet, the softness that wrapped around us. "I should go," I whispered, the words more of a wish than a promise. His hand dropped, the loss of his touch a cold ache. "I know." I started the car, the engine a jarring reminder of reality. He opened the door, his movements slow as if each step took him further away. Before he stepped out, he turned, his expression a mirror of my own, a mix of longing and resignation. "If you need anything," he began, but the words hung unfinished. I nodded, my hands tight on the wheel. "I know." He closed the door and I watched as he walked back to his house, his figure dissolving into the gray of the afternoon. I sat there for a long moment, the taste of him still on my lips, the echo of his voice lingering in the air. When I finally pulled away, the road stretched out before me, winding and uncertain. I drove slowly, my mind a tangle of thoughts and emotions. The world around me felt different, each turn a reminder that there was no going back. I carried the weight of that kiss with me, a secret folded into the quiet spaces of my life, a reminder that beneath the surface, something had irrevocably changed. The days that followed the kiss in the car unfolded with a strange sense of normalcy, as if the world remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil within me. I went through the motions of my life, each task an anchor that kept me tethered to the surface while my mind drifted into uncharted waters. My husband remained a steady presence, his routines unchanged, his affection steady but subdued. He kissed me goodbye in the mornings, his lips a brief brush against my cheek, and I wondered if he noticed how my skin barely reacted, how the warmth that once sparked between us had faded into a soft, distant glow. I found myself slipping into old habits, hiding my thoughts behind practiced smiles and quiet nods. I became an expert at deflection, steering conversations away from the empty spaces between us. When he asked about my day, I gave him the highlights, leaving out the parts where I lingered by the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the neighbor, or the quiet moments where I let my mind wander back to the warmth of his hand in mine. The book he had given me sat on my bedside table, a reminder of the connection we had forged. I read it in small doses, savoring each page like a secret treat, a quiet indulgence that was mine alone. The story within its pages mirrored my own, a tale of longing and unspoken desires, of choices made in the half-light of uncertainty. I found solace in the words, a comfort in knowing that others had walked this path before me, had felt the pull of something just beyond reach. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, my husband suggested a quiet night at home. He pulled out an old board game, the kind we used to play when our relationship was still new, still filled with laughter and late-night conversations. I tried to lose myself in the game, to let the simplicity of the moment fill the empty spaces, but my mind wandered. His questions about my work and friends felt distant, like echoes in a large, empty room. As he rolled the dice, I found myself studying his face, the familiar lines, the soft curve of his smile. There was nothing wrong with him, nothing lacking. He was kind, patient, a good man by all measures. And yet the ache within me persisted, a quiet hum beneath the surface. I wondered if he felt it too, if the space between us had grown too wide to bridge. His laughter was genuine, his touch gentle, but my heart remained still, unmoved by the rhythms of our life. When the game ended, he leaned back, his expression relaxed. "I miss this," he said, his voice soft. "Just being together." "I know," I replied, the words a delicate thread between us. I wanted to feel more, to match his warmth, but my own feelings lay hidden, buried beneath layers of confusion and longing. We sat in silence, the board game between us like a barrier. I felt the weight of his expectations, the quiet hope in his eyes, and it pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I rose to clear the table, my movements slow and deliberate, each step a careful retreat. He let me go, his gaze lingering but his words unspoken. In the kitchen, I let the cool water run over my hands, the rush of it a brief reprieve. I closed my eyes, letting the sound fill the quiet spaces in my mind. When I opened them, I found myself staring out the window, the neighbor's house a dark silhouette against the twilight. The light on his porch flickered, a soft glow that pulled at me, a reminder of the path I had not yet taken. That night as I lay in bed, my husband's arm draped loosely around me, I felt the weight of my divided heart. His breathing was a steady rhythm, a lullaby I had long since grown accustomed to. I matched my breath to his, trying to find solace in the closeness, but all I felt was the space between us, an invisible wall that neither of us seemed able to breach. Sleep did not come easily. I lay awake, my thoughts a tangled web of possibilities and regrets. I wondered if I was capable of turning back, of finding my way back to the life I had built. The comfort of familiarity was a siren call, a promise of safety, but my feet itched to wander, to explore the paths that lay shrouded in shadows. Morning came too quickly, the light slipping through the curtains like a gentle intrusion. My husband stirred beside me, his movements slow and familiar. He kissed my shoulder, a soft brush of his lips, and rose to start his day. I remained still, my body heavy with the weight of decisions unmade. His absence left a cool spot on the bed, a reminder that the warmth I craved was still just beyond reach. As the front door closed behind him, I sat up, my mind clearing in the quiet. I knew what I wanted, but the path to it remained unclear. The memory of the kiss in the car lingered, a quiet echo that reverberated through me. I felt its pull, the soft hum of desire mixed with fear, and I knew that the choice before me was no longer about right or wrong, but about truth, my own truth buried beneath the layers of the life I had built. And so, with the house empty and the day stretching ahead of me, I made a decision. It was not a plan, not yet, but a step forward, a quiet shift in the direction of the path that lay waiting, shrouded in the soft, uncertain light of possibility. The morning arrived cloaked in soft gray, the kind of light that seemed to blur the edges of reality. I moved through the quiet of the house, each step a reminder of how carefully constructed my life had become. My husband had left early, his departure marked by the gentle click of the door and a hurried kiss that barely grazed my cheek. His absence filled the house with an unsettling stillness, an echo that followed me from room to room. I found myself drawn to the small tasks that filled my mornings. I watered the plants, their leaves cool and wet beneath my fingers. I straightened the pillows on the couch, smoothed the edges of the blanket draped over the armrest. It was an old habit, this need to create order, to arrange my world into neat lines and soft corners. But today the routine felt hollow, the motions empty. My thoughts wandered to him, the neighbor. His face drifted through my mind, a quiet presence that had settled into the corners of my life. I could still feel the warmth of his hand, the soft brush of his lips, the weight of the book he had given me. It sat on my nightstand, its worn pages a testament to a different kind of connection, one built on understanding and quiet gestures. It was while I was lost in thought that I heard the soft knock at the door. The sound pulled me back to the present, a gentle reminder that the world outside still moved forward. I opened the door, my heart quickening at the thought of seeing him, of another quiet moment shared between us. But it was not him. Instead, my husband stood on the porch, his expression a mix of expectation and something else, something I couldn't quite read. "Hey," he said, his voice warmer than it had been in a long time. "I got off early today. Thought I'd surprise you." Surprise. The word lingered in the air and I forced a smile, the expression not quite reaching my eyes. "That's great. I wasn't expecting you." He stepped inside, his hands hidden behind his back. "I brought you something." His voice held a note of excitement, a boyish eagerness that felt both familiar and strange. I watched as he revealed a small, neatly wrapped package. The paper was bright, the kind used for birthdays and celebrations, a ribbon tied in a careful bow. I took it from him, my fingers brushing against his, and I felt a pang of something, guilt perhaps or gratitude I couldn't tell. "Open it," he urged, his eyes fixed on me. I slipped the ribbon off, letting it fall in soft loops against the floor. The The paper crinkled beneath my touch and I pulled it away to reveal a delicate box. Inside, nestled against a bed of tissue paper, lay a necklace. The pendant was simple, a small silver heart that caught the light in soft glimmers. "I saw it and I thought of you," he said, his voice softer now. "I know I've been distant. I wanted to make it up to you." His words settled between us, heavy with meaning. I traced the outline of the pendant with my thumb, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his gaze. I felt the tug of emotion, a quiet ache that wound its way through my chest. He was reaching out in the only way he knew how. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the gesture, no matter how thoughtful, arrived too late. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice steady. "Thank you." He smiled, the expression lighting up his face, and I felt the weight of my own duplicity. The necklace lay in my palm, a gift meant to draw us closer, but all I felt was the distance between us, a chasm carved by time and unspoken words. He moved closer, his hand resting on my shoulder. "I thought we could go out tonight. Dinner maybe? Just us." His touch was gentle, his voice filled with hope, and I felt the walls closing in. I nodded, the motion automatic, and he pulled me into a hug. His arms wrapped around me, solid and sure, and I let myself lean into it, if only for a moment. His heartbeat thudded against my ear, a steady rhythm that had once been my own. When he pulled away, I busied myself with the necklace, slipping it into the box and setting it aside. "I'll get ready," I said, my voice a thin thread of sound. He disappeared into the other room and I stood in the quiet, my mind racing. His gift was a reminder of all that I had, all that I stood to lose. The choice before me grew sharper, the lines more defined. I felt the weight of it, the press of reality against the soft edges of my escape. As I dressed for dinner, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The silver heart lay against my skin, a small, shining promise. I traced it with my fingers, the cool metal grounding me, and I wondered if it was possible to find my way back, to mend the frayed edges of our life. I turned away, the image of myself fading into the shadows, and I knew that the answer lay not in gifts or gestures but in the choices I made in the quiet spaces, in the moments where the truth lingered just beneath the surface. Dinner with my husband felt like stepping into an old photograph, familiar yet frozen in time. He had chosen a small restaurant downtown, the kind of place we used to visit before life became a series of routines. The dim lighting and soft clink of silverware against plates created a cocoon of intimacy, but the warmth of the room did little to thaw the chill between us. He ordered wine, his smile tentative as if testing the waters of our conversation. We spoke about safe things, the weather, the new coffee shop that opened down the street, the neighbor's dog who always seemed to escape its yard. Our words skimmed the surface, rippling the water but never diving beneath. I caught him watching me between bites, his gaze soft but searching. I felt exposed, as if he could see the cracks beneath my skin, the quiet fracture lines where my life had begun to split. I pushed my food around my plate, the edges of my appetite dulled by the weight of everything left unsaid. When dessert arrived, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. His touch was gentle, a question wrapped in warmth. "I miss this," he said, echoing words he had spoken before. His voice held a thread of hope, a delicate line cast into the depths between us. I forced a smile, the gesture tight against my cheeks. "Me too." But the words felt hollow, like stones dropped into still water. The ripples never reached him. We walked home in silence, his hand wrapped around mine. The night air bit against my skin, sharp and crisp, a reminder that the world outside moved forward even when I felt stuck. His grip was steady, but I felt no pull, no gravity holding me to him. I moved beside him, my steps careful, each one measured against the growing sense that I was walking in the wrong direction. At home, he wrapped his arms around me, his embrace a soft cage. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. I wanted to match my breathing to his, to find comfort in the familiarity, but my own heart beat its own rhythm, a quiet, insistent reminder that I was not where I needed to be. When he fell asleep, his body a gentle curve against the sheets, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house seemed to expand around me, the shadows stretching into shapes that pressed against my skin. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. Each step was a whisper, a promise not to break the quiet of the night. I found myself by the window, the street outside bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. His house stood just beyond the curve of the road, a dark silhouette against the sky. I wondered if he was awake, if he felt the same restless pull, the same ache beneath his skin. The memory of his touch lingered, a ghost that wrapped itself around me, warm and undeniable. My phone lay on the table, its screen a dark mirror. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the smooth glass. The urge to call him, to hear his voice, was a low thrum beneath my skin. But I hesitated, the weight of my choices pressing down, a stone against my chest. Instead, I typed out a message, the words simple but heavy. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. The room held its breath, the air thick with the possibility of what might come next. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness settle around me, and pressed send. The message slipped into the night, a small spark against the dark. His reply came almost instantly, the screen lighting up with his name. "Come over." The invitation hung in the air, a thread between us, and I felt the pull, the soft, insistent tug that led me to the door. I moved quietly, my steps careful, each one a small rebellion against the life I had built. The cool night air wrapped around me as I slipped outside, the world holding its breath as I crossed the street. His door opened before I knocked, his silhouette framed by the warm light inside. His expression was open, unguarded, and I felt the last of my hesitation melt away. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a soft click, sealing us in a world of our own making. We sat on the couch, the space between us a fragile line. His hand found mine, his fingers threading through the spaces, a quiet promise. I felt the weight of his touch, the warmth that seeped into my skin, and for the first time in a long time I breathed. Really breathed, filling my lungs with air that felt lighter, clearer. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "I wasn't sure if I should," I replied, my own voice a quiet echo. We sat like that, our words small ripples in the stillness. His thumb traced circles against my hand, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of my heart. The world outside seemed to fade, the walls of his home closing in around us, creating a space where the only truth was the one we had not yet spoken. In the silence, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down, a soft but insistent pressure. I knew that whatever happened next would draw a line through my life, a mark that could not be erased. The crossroads lay before me, each path shrouded in shadows, each step a leap into the unknown. And so, with his hand in mine, I took the first step. The future lay ahead, an unwritten story, and for the first time I felt ready to turn the page. The morning sun slipped through the blinds, casting soft ribbons of light across the room. I lay still, the weight of the blankets a gentle pressure against my skin, but beneath them I felt exposed, raw. The quiet was different here. Deeper, less forgiving. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of the world waking up outside. Each sound seemed amplified, the silence pressing against my chest. His house felt both familiar and foreign. I had been here before, shared stolen moments wrapped in the soft glow of lamplight, but this was different. The night had drawn a line through my life, a thin, sharp cut that separated before from after. I could feel it, the sting of it still fresh. A reminder that choices once made could not be unmade. He moved beside me, the bed dipping with his weight. His hand found mine beneath the covers, a simple gesture that held more weight than I was ready to carry. His touch was warm, grounding, but I felt the pull of reality like a current beneath still waters. I closed my eyes, breathing in the quiet, but it offered no comfort. The world beyond these walls had not changed, only the way I fit into it. "I should go," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. His fingers tightened around mine, a soft plea. "You don't have to." But I did. I felt it in my bones, the inevitability of it. I pulled my hand away gently, the loss of his touch a cold ache. He didn't press me, didn't fill the space with words that might break the fragile peace between us. Instead he rose, his movements careful, as if the air itself might shatter. I dressed in the quiet, each motion deliberate. My clothes hung on me differently, the fabric brushing against skin that felt new, unfamiliar. His eyes followed me, a soft weight that I carried with me as I moved through the room. I felt the questions he did not ask, the answers I could not give. At the door he stood close, the space between us filled with all the things we could not say. His hand reached for mine, a brief touch, a tether. "Will I see you again?" I hesitated, the truth tangled in my throat. "I don't know." It was the only answer I had, the only truth I could offer. He nodded, a small, accepting gesture. His expression held no anger, only the quiet resignation of someone who understood the weight of choices. I stepped outside, the cool air biting against my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of his home. The world felt too bright, too open, and I wrapped my arms around myself, a feeble shield against the day. The walk home was a blur of sound and movement. My feet carried me forward, each step a quiet rebellion against the urge to turn back. I felt the weight of my decisions pressing down, a heavy cloak that settled over my shoulders. The streets were empty, the early hour lending a sense of stillness, and I moved through it like a ghost, unseen and untouched. When I reached my house, I stood at the door, my hand resting against the cool metal. It felt different, the weight of it unfamiliar. I turned the handle slowly, slipping inside, the house greeting me with its practiced silence. My husband's shoes sat by the door, a quiet reminder of the life that waited inside. His coat hung neatly on the rack, the familiar shape of it tugging at something deep within me. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes lifted when I entered, and for a moment the world held its breath. His expression was open, a soft vulnerability that made my own defenses crumble. I moved to the chair across from him, the wood cool against my skin, and we sat like that, the table a thin barrier between us. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I kept waiting for the door to open. I nodded, the motion small, but he saw it. His fingers tightened around the cup, his knuckles pale against the ceramic. "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question hung in the air, a fragile thread. I felt the weight of it, the pull of honesty and the safety of silence. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat a countdown, a reminder that this moment could shape everything that came after. "I don't know how to start," I said, the words falling between us, soft but sharp. He didn't push, his patience a quiet strength. "Then just start where you are." And so I did. I let the words come, each one a small release, a fragment of the truth that had settled into my bones. I spoke of the emptiness, the quiet spaces between us that had grown too wide to bridge. I told him about the loneliness, the ache that had driven me to seek comfort in places I shouldn't have. I did not speak of specifics, did not draw lines between then and now, but the truth lay bare between us, a quiet, undeniable presence. When I finished, the silence wrapped around us, a soft shroud. He closed his eyes, his breath a slow, measured rhythm. I waited, the air thick with the weight of all the ways this could end. His hand moved, a small, deliberate motion, and he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. "I wish I had known," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I wish I had seen you before you felt invisible." Tears slipped down my cheeks, silent and warm. His hand held mine, a lifeline in the quiet. We sat like that, the morning light creeping into the room, filling the spaces with a soft, golden glow. It felt like a beginning, fragile and new, and I breathed it in, letting the air fill the empty spaces within me. The ending lay ahead, unwritten and uncertain, but for the first time I felt ready to face it. With him, with myself, with the truth that lingered in the light.